June 10th, 1942. On a lonely stretch of Alaskan tundra, a silver-gray shape lay half-buried in the moss. Its wings were folded awkwardly, one half torn, the other perfectly smooth. Steam still rose from the shattered engine cowling, hissing in the cold wind off the Bering Sea. Nearby, face down in the marsh, lay the body of a young man in a flight suit, 20-something, clean-faced, his parachute still strapped to his back. His name was Tadayoshi Koga, and his aircraft was something the Americans had only ever seen from a distance, through gunsight glass or in the blur of defeat, a Mitsubishi A6M0. For 6 months, the Zero had been untouchable. It had ruled the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, appearing and vanishing with impossible grace. Allied pilots described it in disbelief, a plane that could climb faster, turn tighter, and linger longer than anything they flew. It seemed immune to pursuit, invulnerable to counterattack. When it came, it killed quickly. When it left, it disappeared like smoke. To the men who faced it, the Zero was not a machine, but an apparition. Now in this remote place called Akatan Island, an afterthought on the map, the ghost had fallen to earth. Koga's fuel line had ruptured during a raid on Dutch Harbor. Trying to save his aircraft, he had chosen a patch of open tundra for an emergency landing. The soft ground caught his landing gear. The Zero flipped, snapping its pilot's neck in an instant. The plane, miraculously, remained almost whole. When the American recovery team arrived days later, they stood in silence. Before them lay the enemy's secret, not burned, not shattered, but waiting. They didn't yet know what they were looking at. They only knew that hundreds of their own had died fighting this shape in the sky, and now, at last, it had a face. In that wreckage lay more than a dead pilot and a machine. It was the turning point of an invisible war, one fought not in the clouds, but in the quiet, patient work of understanding. And soon, this fallen fighter would teach its enemies how to destroy it. In the first months after Pearl Harbor, the Pacific belonged to one machine. It appeared suddenly in the morning sun, slender, white, and silent until its guns spoke. Allied pilots who survived called it a phantom, a creature that seemed to rewrite the laws of flight. The Mitsubishi A6M0. It could climb where others stalled, turn where others broke apart, and vanish before a trigger was even pulled. Over the Coral Sea, over Wake, over the Philippines, the story was always the same. American and British fighters fell in spirals of smoke, their pilots never even seeing what had killed them. The Zero did not simply outperform, it humiliated. Against it, the F-4F Wildcat, the Brewster Buffalo, even the rugged P-40 were outclassed in every metric that mattered. Its turning radius was half that of its opponents, its range nearly twice as far. A single squadron of Zeros could cripple an entire airfield before the defenders could climb to altitude. In the language of combat reports, one phrase repeated like a prayer: "It climbs like a god." What few in Washington understood was that this aircraft was not a miracle. It was the product of method, an engineering philosophy the West had dismissed as impossible. Japan, they believed, could copy, not innovate. Its factories were thought incapable of precision work. American designers built their planes to survive damage. Japanese engineers built theirs to avoid it entirely. The result was an aircraft so light it seemed to defy gravity itself. It was perfection born of fragility. Every engagement reinforced the myth. Experience, numbers, courage, none could close the gap. The Zero was more than a weapon. It was an idea, the belief that speed and grace could replace armor and firepower. But ideas have weaknesses too. And one summer morning, in the cold mud of a forgotten Alaskan island, that idea had fallen from the sky. Within days, intelligence officers sent word to San Diego. An intact Zero had been found. At last, America would have the chance to look its enemy in the eye. The discovery on Akatan spread through the Pacific Intelligence Network like a whispered miracle. An intact Zero, not a wreck, not a rumor, but a complete aircraft, had been found and secured. In an age before satellites or captured archives, this was as if an enemy had handed over his codebook. Within days, a recovery team disassembled the plane piece by piece, crating each section under armed guard. The tundra's mud still clung to its landing gear as it was lifted onto a transport ship bound for San Diego. The journey of the dead pilot's machine had begun. At North Island Naval Air Station, engineers waited like surgeons preparing for an autopsy. Every component was tagged, measured, and sketched by hand. The men who worked on it moved with a S. Trained reverence, not hatred, but respect. Rivet by rivet, they came to understand the philosophy behind its creation. The fuselage was impossibly thin, the control surfaces balanced to fractions of an inch. Where American aircraft used armor, the Zero used air, the empty space that made it lighter, faster, and infinitely more vulnerable. Weeks passed before the final shape re-emerged. The plane was restored not as a trophy, but as a living question. It bore a new designation, A6M221, Captured Zero, Bureau number 4593. On its tail, technicians painted an American star over the red circle it had once worn. The symbol of Japan's aerial supremacy now stood under new colors, awaiting its first flight under a different sun. The Navy needed a pilot, not a showman, not a hero, but someone who could think like an engineer while flying like a fighter. They chose Eddie Sanders, a 31-year-old test pilot known for calm precision. He had no illusions about what he was stepping into. The Zero had no manuals, no safety margins, no forgiveness. One error, and the experiment would end as its last had inverted in the ground. Still, Sanders agreed without hesitation. Somewhere in the lines of this aircraft was the answer to 1,000 deaths. Understanding, it meant understanding how to win. As the plane rolled out into the California light, its propeller turning once more, no one yet knew it was not just being rebuilt, it was being translated. And soon, America would learn to speak its language. Eddie Sanders was not a man of spectacle. At 31, his reputation rested not on combat kills or newspaper headlines, but on precision, the quiet, mathematical courage of a test pilot. At North Island Naval Air Station, where the Pacific's wind carried both salt and rumor, he was known as calm to the point of mystery. Sanders approached flight not as an act of bravado, but as a conversation with physics. Where others saw danger, he saw data. When he was assigned to the Captured Zero, he didn't celebrate. He studied. He spent hours in the hangar long after the engineers had gone home, walking slow circles around the Japanese fighter as if listening to it. He traced its contours with his eyes, its proportions, its logic. The rivets were smaller than anything on an American plane. The joints seamless. Even the control rod seemed lighter, thinner, designed not for forgiveness, but for trust. Every ounce of unnecessary weight had been stripped away. What he saw defied every assumption of Western design. The Zero was not primitive. It was perfection achieved through sacrifice. Where American engineers added armor, the Japanese removed it. Where others built planes to survive hits, they built one to avoid them altogether. It was an aircraft of philosophy as much as engineering, a belief that speed and maneuver could replace steel. Fragile, yes, but flawless in purpose. Sanders began to understand its creators, not as enemies, but as thinkers who had dared to abandon convention. He read translated reports from captured pilots, studied fragments of Japanese manuals, even examined the characters stenciled along the cockpit frame. There was an elegance to it all, a kind of humility in design, nothing wasted, nothing hidden. The Zero was as light as air could allow, a dancer built for war. But it was also a paradox. Its beauty was bound to its weakness. A single burst of gunfire could turn its grace into fire. Sanders knew that to master it, he would have to think as its pilots did, not with armor, but with instinct. To fly this machine was to balance on the edge between control and catastrophe. As the ground crews finished their checks, he made his notes in silence. His task was not simply to test an aircraft. It was to step into the mind of an enemy who had already mastered the sky. What Sanders didn't yet know was that in learning their rhythm, he would help destroy it. On the morning of September 20, 1942, the hangars at North Island fell silent. Mechanics stepped back from their tools, engineers folded their arms, and a handful of officers stood at the edge of the runway, eyes fixed on a single figure walking toward the sunlight. Eddie Sanders climbed into the cockpit of the Captured Zero, its skin freshly painted, its heart still foreign. No one spoke. The sound of the starter motor broke the stillness, followed by a cough of life from the Saki-12 radial engine. The enemy's creation had awakened under an American flag. As the propeller spun into a blur, Sanders felt the vibrations through the seats smoother, lighter than any American fighter he'd flown. He ran through the checks one last time, then eased the throttle forward. The plane began to roll, gathering speed with eerie grace. At 70 knots it lifted effortlessly, as if gravity had simply forgotten its claim. The airfield shrank beneath him. For the first time, a U.S. pilot was flying the machine that had haunted their skies for a year. At altitude, sensation was unlike anything he'd known. The controls responded with the slightest touch, not with force but with thought. The Zero turned not through muscle, but intention. It climbed on command, banked like a bird, and seemed to anticipate motion before he finished it. Sanders realized, for the first time, what Japanese pilots must have felt. An intimacy with their aircraft so complete it blurred the line between man and machine. But as he pushed it harder, the illusion began to fray. In a dive, the wings trembled violently, the stick growing heavy in his hands. At high speed, the Zero resisted control, its frame shuddering under forces it was never built to endure. Sanders leveled out just in time, heart steady but eyes narrowed. The beauty of the design had revealed its flaw. The aircraft that ruled through agility could not survive brute speed. The same lightness that made it divine made it mortal. When he landed, the silence returned, the same silence that had greeted his takeoff, but heavier now, filled with understanding. Sanders stepped down from the cockpit, his flight suit streaked with oil, his expression unreadable. "It flies," he said simply, but in his notebook the words were sharper: superb maneuverability at low speed, fragile at high speed. In that first flight, the myth of invincibility had cracked. What had seemed like perfection was now revealed as balance, one that could be tipped if understood. The Zero had taught him how it lived. Next, he would learn how it could die. For the next 6 weeks, the sky above San Diego became a classroom. Each morning, Eddie Sanders strapped himself into the cockpit of the captured Zero and took off into the pale light, alone, silent, and watched by men with notebooks and cameras. 24 flights in total. Each one a dialogue between two philosophies, Japanese grace and American calculation. He flew it higher, faster, risked more with every sortie. At low speed, the Zero was divine. It turned inside any aircraft on Earth, responding with almost psychic precision. It needed no force, no muscle. The plane anticipated the pilot's intention. Sanders felt the seduction of that perfection, how a pilot could mistake beauty for invincibility. But when he pushed past the limits, he saw the illusion crack. At 300 knots, the controls stiffened until the stick felt welded in place. The wings, once fluid, resisted the air with violent shudder. Roll rate collapsed. The same lightness that made the Zero supreme in the dance of the dogfight betrayed it in the dive. Its thin skin buckled. Its frame screamed against the speed. Sanders knew that at 400 knots, it would not endure. On another flight, he tested its endurance under strain, steep climbs, sudden rolls, side slips through turbulence. The results were precise and brutal. The Zero's fuel tanks, unarmored and placed behind the pilot, ruptured easily. A single incendiary round could ignite the cockpit. Its engine, though efficient, could not handle abuse. It was a samurai blade, flawless in form, but brittle under force. Back on the ground, engineers crowded around his reports. They measured the weaknesses in degrees and seconds. Poor roll rate above 250 knots. Control flutter beyond 350. Fuel system unprotected. Armor non-existent. The myth was dissolving into mathematics. What had seemed supernatural was now understandable and therefore conquerable. Sanders wrote it plainly: Zero dominates only in its own fight. Force it out of its chosen battle, deny it the slow turns, the elegant climbs, and its power collapsed. Make it dive, make it chase, make it fight like an American, and it would lose. In Grumman's design offices, men read these words like revelation. They did not copy the Zero's genius, they inverted it. Heaviness would become advantage. Power would replace purity. The next generation of fighters, the F-6F Hellcat, the F-4U Corsair, would not dance with the Zero, they would crush it. Sanders had unlocked the paradox of perfection. That flawlessness is fragile when forced to live outside its own design. And somewhere in a hangar on Long Island, Engineers were already sketching the machine that would prove it. On Long Island, far from the front lines and the smoke of the Pacific, a different kind of war was being fought. Inside the Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, draftsmen and engineers sat beneath the cold light of factory lamps, their tables covered in blueprints, coffee stains, and fragments of aluminium. They were not soldiers, yet they carried the same burden to design something that could survive where men could not. Their newest project was the F-6F, a replacement for the aging Wildcat, conceived before Akatan, before the Zero had a face. It was meant to be heavier, sturdier, a natural evolution of what had come before. But then the reports from San Diego arrived, Eddie Sanders, notes, sketches, and measured truths about the enemy's masterpiece. They landed on T. He engineers desks like sacred text. For the first time, America understood the physics of its defeat. The Zero's grace came from compromise, lightness over armor, agility over strength. It could turn on instinct, but could not dive. It could climb like a spirit, but could not endure punishment. And so the equation flipped. The F-6F would not imitate beauty, it would weaponize endurance. Grumman's chief engineer, William Schwendler, and designer Robert Hall reimagined the fighter overnight. The airframe thickened. The wings widened to carry more lift and ammunition. A 2,000-horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine replaced the old Wildcat's modest radial. Every weakness the Zero possessed became a coordinate to reverse. Where the Japanese built light, the Americans built strong. Where the Zero burned easily, the Hellcat would walk through fire. The first prototype rolled out of the Bethpage plant in June 1942, its shape both familiar and alien, a brawler compared to the Zero's dancer. When test pilots climbed into its cockpit, they noticed the difference immediately. The canopy felt safer, armored like a tank turret. The controls were heavier, the frame more stubborn. It didn't respond with grace, it responded with power. It wasn't made to follow an enemy, it was made to dominate one. At Grumman's private airstrip, test pilot Corky Mayer took the prototype aloft for its first flight. The Hellcat rose not with elegance but authority. In a steep climb, the engine's roar drowned its own echo. The Zero, for all its brilliance, had to conserve energy, its light frame trembling at high speed. The Hellcat demanded none of that restraint. It clawed at the sky, gaining altitude faster than anything the Navy had flown. It wasn't agile, it was unstoppable. Every test revealed more of its intent. In dives, it remained steady, rolling where the Zero froze. In gunnery trials, its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns tore through the air with surgical fury. Engineers reinforced the landing gear to endure carrier landings and rough seas, while armor plates surrounded the cockpit, fuel tanks, and engine. Each feature came at the cost of weight, but the data from Sanders' flights had made it clear. Weight could be weaponized if the engine was strong enough. By autumn, the aircraft had a name whispered in workshops and hangars alike: Hellcat, not graceful, not divine, simply inevitable. The men who built it did not call it beautiful. They called it dependable, forgiving, obedient. It was the kind of machine that could take damage, lose a cylinder, and still bring its pilot home. As the first production models rolled off the line, naval strategists studied the specifications in silence. On paper, the Zero still outturned it, but in every other measure, speed, dive rate, survivability, the F-6F was superior. What had begun as imitation had become evolution. The Japanese fighter had been designed for perfection, the American one for persistence. At the end of 1942, crates of Hellcats began to ship westward. Their blue wings glinted under winter sun, bound for the carriers waiting at Pearl Harbor. Few of the men loading them knew how much of the enemy's genius lived inside those machines, or how thoroughly it had been rewritten. Japan still believed its Zero ruled the sky. But somewhere over the Pacific, a new predator was already rising to meet it. The reports from San Diego did not stay on the coast. They moved eastward, copied, studied, annotated, until the words of a single test pilot shaped an entire nation's understanding of war. Eddie Sanders' notes, once scribbled in cockpit shorthand, were now doctrine. At Grumman, at Vought, at naval training schools from Florida to Hawaii, the data of a dead Japanese pilot became the foundation for a new way of thinking. The engineers called it intelligence. The pilots called it survival. Every page carried instructions written in the quiet language of physics: speed over grace, energy over motion, patience over impulse. Sanders' simple phrases, "Zero wins only at low speed," became gospel. His diagrams, showing the zero's turn radius and stall limits, were pinned to classroom walls beside photographs of wrecked aircraft. What once had been myth, a ghost that ruled the Pacific, was now a measurable, mortal machine. From those pages came the new commandments of air combat: never turn with a zero, dive to escape, climb only with advantage. These were not slogans, they were laws tested in blood. The Navy's flight instructors drilled them into new recruits with precision bordering on ritual. Every simulation began with the same scenario: a zero on your tail, the sky closing in. Every lesson ended the same way: a controlled dive, a burst of speed, and the knowledge that mastery of physics could defeat even the perfect machine. Across the Pacific, the results began to show. The panic that had once filled radio channels during dogfights, the frantic cries of Zero's ab. Ove Zero's behind, faded into coordination. American pilots no longer chased the enemy through twisting, spiraling duels. They climbed, waited, and struck. A zero that turned was a zero that died. The fear that had once been instinct was replaced by a colder emotion: calculation. But the change was not only in the air, it was cultural. For years, American designers had believed in mass and might, in building aircraft that could withstand punishment rather than avoid it. The Zero's elegance forced them to rethink. Grumman's engineers began to see artistry not as softness, but as discipline. Weight, once an enemy, became a tool to balance stability and power. Even as they built machines to destroy the Zero, they were quietly learning from it. The enemy's genius had been absorbed into their own. This transformation reached beyond factories and airfields. It touched the entire psychology of American warfare. The men who once admired the Zero for its grace now respected it for what it revealed about themselves: their arrogance, their assumptions, their limits. The war in the Pacific had begun as a contest of weapons. It was becoming a dialogue between philosophies. For Japan, perfection was purity, to strip away all excess until only the essential remained. For America, perfection was adaptation, to learn, adjust, and overpower through understanding. Each flight, each blueprint, each adjustment on a drawing board was an argument between those two ideas. By late 1943, that argument was tilting westward. The Zero, once unpredictable, had become familiar. Pilots could anticipate its turns, sense its next move, almost see through its pilot's hands. The hunter had become the studied specimen. Sanders continued his test flights quietly, his findings still flowing back to the design rooms. He rarely spoke of them publicly, but the results spoke for him, in the calm confidence of the Hellcat pilots, in the training films that now began with certainty rather than fear, and in the tone of commanders who no longer said, if they could win, but when. War, at its core, had become intellectual. Equations replaced adrenaline, precision replaced panic. And as the first Hellcat squadrons prepared to launch from the decks of Essex-class carriers, the final proof of this philosophy waited just beyond the horizon. Because soon, the blueprints would leave the drafting tables and face the ghosts that had inspired them. By the summer of 1943, the blueprints had become reality. From the assembly lines of Bethpage, Long Island, the first F-6F Hellcats rolled into the sunlight, their fuselages a deep navy blue, their wings broad and patient. Crates of parts and engines, stamped with serial numbers and handwritten initials, made their slow journey westward by rail and ship. Each one represented the final product of 1,000 calculations, of Sanders' quiet reports, and the engineers who had turned knowledge into weaponry. The Hellcat arrived in the Pacific with little ceremony. It was not elegant, not beautiful, but it did not need to be. It was built to endure. On September 1, 1943, from the decks of USS Yorktown, a new sound rose over the sea, not the shrill note of the Zero, but the deep, confident thunder of the Pratt & Whitney R-2800. It was the sound of power reclaiming altitude. Its first trial came swiftly. The target was the Marcus Islands, a remote Japanese airfield carved into coral, defended by veteran pilots who still believed the Zero was untouchable. For 2 years, they had ruled this airspace. Now, for the first time, they met something born from their own reflection. As the Hellcats climbed into formation, the pilots felt the difference instantly. The controls were solid but forgiving. The aircraft accelerated with confidence rather than delicacy. There was no fragile balance to preserve, no sense of fear beneath the wings. At 20,000 feet, the Zero had always owned the initiative, but the Hellcat did not chase, it commanded. When the first dogfights began, the contrast was brutal. The Zero, light and agile, twisted through the air in graceful arcs, but the Hellcat did not follow its dance. It cut through it. A single burst from 6.50 caliber Brownings could shred the enemy in seconds, where the Zero whispered across the wind. The Hellcat roared, its engine a mechanical declaration that the age of the delicate had ended. Pilots returned from those first missions with disbelief in their eyes. They spoke not of luck, but of control, of a machine that obeyed even under pressure. Lieutenant Commander Butch Hayer described the F-6F as the first plane that truly belonged to the pilot, not the air. Others called it forgiving, humane even. You could make mistakes in a Hellcat and still come home. The same error in a Zero would be fatal. The statistics told the story faster than words could. In its first 6 months of combat, the Hellcat achieved a kill ratio of 13-1. By early 1944, that figure climbed even higher. The advantage once held by the Zero evaporated in the roar of the new American fighters. For every Hellcat lost, nearly 20 enemy aircraft fell. The air war that had begun as a Japanese symphony of precision was now an American rhythm of power. Eddie Sanders followed these reports from his desk at North Island. The Zero he had once flown sat in a hangar nearby, its paint faded, its purpose fulfilled. He had watched it live again in the curves and rivets of the F-6F, and now he watched its ghost vanish in the skies it once ruled. His logbooks, once filled with data, had become history in motion. What began as a crash on a remote, Alaskan island had become a shift in the balance of the Pacific. The weapon that once symbolized Japanese dominance had unknowingly fathered the machine that would destroy it. In the coming year, the Hellcat would sweep across the central Pacific, from the Marshalls to the Marianas, carrying with it the lessons learned from the wreck on Akutan Island. And with every victory, one truth grew clearer: Japan's greatest secret had not been stolen, it had been understood. But the war was not yet over. Ahead lay the great aerial duels of 1944, the test not of design, but of destiny, where the Hellcat would face the Zero in its final stand. By June 1944, the Pacific had turned into a battlefield of horizons. Across the blue expanse east of the Marianas, carriers of the U.S. Fifth Fleet advanced in silence, their decks lined with the dark silhouettes of the F-6F Hellcat. Beneath them, the ocean shimmered like metal under the sun. Above them, unseen, waited the last defenders of Japan's fading empire. The battle began on the morning of June 19. Radar screens aboard the carriers lit up with hundreds of contacts. They came in dense formations: Mitsubishi Zeros, Nakajima dive bombers, torpedo planes, the remains of an air arm that once defined the Pacific War. From Guam and Saipan, from Tinian and the carriers beyond, they rose into the sky to meet an enemy they no longer understood. The Americans launched to intercept. Within minutes, the air above the fleet became a living storm. Hellcats climbed in disciplined arcs, the product of doctrine refined by years of study, training, and intelligence born from one captured plane. Their pilots spoke little. They had no need to improvise. Every maneuver, every engagement was a pattern rehearsed. At 25,000 feet, the two forces collided. What followed was not a dogfight. It was a physics lesson written in flame and vapor. The Zero tried to do what it had always done: turn, roll, and dance. Its pilots sought to pull their opponents into slow spirals where agility could outweigh power, but the Hellcats refused to follow. They stayed fast, high, and heavy, converting altitude into energy, energy into speed. The difference was visible even from the decks below. Zeros curved through elegant arcs, their paths weaving like brushstrokes. The Hellcats struck through them like hammers through glass. The Japanese fighters, built for a war of movement, were caught in one of momentum. In seconds, beauty met brute inevitability. For the Japanese pilots, it was a cruel transformation. They had grown up on the myth of the invincible Zero, trained in the belief that skill and spirit could overcome anything. But no skill could fight gravity, and no courage could add horsepower. Their once masterful machines, designed for 1940, were dying in 1944, fragile frames meeting engines twice their strength. The best among them fought with desperate elegance, their turns perfect, their fire disciplined. But for every American lost, 20 Japanese went down. The battle would come to be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a phrase coined by pilots who struggled to describe the scale of destruction. Nearly 400 Japanese aircraft were destroyed that day, many without ever sighting the fleet they were meant to attack. The sky that once belonged to the rising sun was now a graveyard of burning aluminium. From his carrier, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher watched the reports flow in, the names of pilots, the tallies of kills, the coordinates of downed enemies. Each number carried the weight of years of preparation, of every blueprint, every test flight, every ation that had turned knowledge into advantage. The work that began with a single wrecked Zero on an Alaskan island had reached its final, blinding proof. As the sun set over the Pacific, the smoke of hundreds of fallen aircraft drifted into the clouds, their contrails dissolving into gold and gray. The American pilots landed one by one, engines still warm, hands trembling not from fear but from exhaustion. They had done what their predecessors could not. They had met the Zero on its own stage and rewritten the ending. In one afternoon, the balance of the air war changed forever. The machine that once defined Japan's mastery had been undone by its own reflection, by the understanding it had unwillingly given to its enemy. But in the wreckage of that perfect day, one truth lingered: no victory was ever absolute. For even as the Hellcats dominated the sky, another thought crept into the minds of their builders and pilots alike. If perfection could fall so easily, what would replace it next? By the closing months of 1945, the Pacific sky had been remade. Where once the white insignia of the rising sun had ruled, now circled the deep blue silhouettes of the Hellcat, a machine that had turned data into dominance. The final numbers told the story with a precision only history could match: 5,163 enemy aircraft destroyed, 270 lost in return. A ratio so vast it seemed unreal, 19 victories for every defeat. But behind the number was not luck, nor arrogance, it was calculation. To the men who had fought in the first chaotic years of the war, the Hellcat's perfection seemed almost unnatural. In 1942, the Zero had been a ghost, untouchable, omnipresent, a whisper of death across the Pacific. By 1945, it was a memory. The transformation had not been born from fire or fury, but from discipline, from the methodical understanding of an enemy's genius. Every bolt on the Hellcat's frame, every curve of its wing, carried within it the quiet logic of stolen knowledge. The ratio, 19-1, became a legend in the briefings and manuals that followed. It was repeated in classrooms, written on blackboards, printed in technical journals. But few who quoted it ever spoke of where it began, in the mud of Akutan Island, beside the broken body of Tadayoshi Koga, whose immaculate aircraft had fallen not in battle, but by accident. What his death revealed, Eddie Sanders had translated into science. And what Sanders recorded, Grumman's engineers had transformed into geometry. The Navy knew it, even if it rarely said it aloud. Victory had not come from a miracle of design, but from the humility to learn. The Hellcat did not simply outperform its enemies, it embodied a philosophy. It was built by those who believed that knowledge, not courage, decided survival. The engineers of Bethpage had studied the Zero not to copy it, but to invert it, to turn every strength into a weakness, every vulnerability into an advantage. When historians later examined the data, they found that only a fraction of Hellcat pilots were aces. The aircraft itself was the ace. It absorbed error, forgave misjudgment, and allowed ordinary men to survive extraordinary combat. Its thick armor could take hits that would tear a Zero apart. Its rugged engine could limp home on one cylinder. The plane was not graceful, but it was faithful, and in war, faithfulness mattered more than beauty. The 19-1 ratio was the mathematical expression of something larger, the triumph of intellect over instinct. In the first years of the war, both sides had fought with emotion, with the courage of belief. By the end, one side had replaced belief with method. Doctrine, discipline, and engineering had become the new forms of valor. The Zero's creators had trusted the pilot. The Hellcat's creators had trusted the process. Eddie Sanders never claimed credit for the number. He watched from the quiet edges of the war, his work complete long before the first Hellcat entered combat. Yet the pilots who flew them, the young men who returned from the Marianas, from Leyte, from Okinawa, owed him their lives. In the hangars of North Island, the captured Zero still stood under canvas cover, its paint flaking, its myth disarmed. Visitors passed it without pause, unaware that in its silence lay the blueprint of victory. For the Navy, the war's moral was clear. Understanding was a weapon, one more devastating than any bomb. The Allies had not simply overpowered their enemy, they had outthought him. The captured Zero had not just revealed how Japan built planes, it had revealed how Japan thought about war. And from that revelation came a generation of machines built not on assumption, but on analysis. The Hellcat's 19:1 ratio was more than arithmetic. It was an equation of humility, of learning from what was once feared, of mastering through respect. It marked the moment when air combat ceased to be art and became science. But even as the Navy celebrated its victory, another kind of silence settled over the hangars and the factories. The men who had designed, tested, and flown these machines had seen what mastery could achieve and what it could erase. Because when knowledge becomes a weapon, there is always a question waiting just beyond the numbers. What happens when understanding itself becomes the most dangerous force of all? Eddie Sanders never looked like a man who changed the course of a war. There were no medals on his chest, no parades in his honor. At 32, he was an unassuming engineer with a pilot's posture, quiet, precise, and infinitely curious. When the Pacific burned and the world celebrated victory, he returned to his hangar at North Island, where engines still echoed in the rafters. While others toasted the end of combat, Sanders was already studying the next set of data. He never flew in combat, never fired a gun in anger. Yet every pilot who returned from the Pacific in one piece owed something to his hands. His flights in the captured Zero had rewritten the laws of aerial combat, not through bravery in battle, but through understanding. He had faced the enemy's machine not with hostility, but with discipline, trusting that knowledge could save more lives than vengeance ever could. In the years after the war, Sanders remained at his post, a test pilot and engineer for the Navy's Experimental Aircraft Division. He flew prototypes no one would remember, solving problems before they could reach the battlefield. To those who knew him, he seemed unchanged by the weight of his own legacy. But those who worked beside him noticed a certain reverence in his tone whenever the Zero came up, not admiration, not nostalgia, but respect. The Akutan Zero, as it came to be known, was restored once more after the war. Its aluminum skin bore scars from the tundra, its rising sun faded to a pale ghost of red. For years it sat under hangar light, an artifact of both brilliance and defeat. Today it rests behind museum glass, silent, immaculate, perfectly still. Visitors walk past its wings without realizing that this shape, this engine, this balance of air and steel once held the secret to the Pacific War. Sanders visited it only once. He stood quietly before the aircraft, hands in his pockets, his reflection merging with that of the enemy's symbol. To him, it was never a trophy. It was a teacher. In the empty museum, the air was still, but in his memory, he could feel the hum of the Saki engine, the delicate vibration of a machine so responsive it seemed alive. He remembered its grace, its fragility, the moment it had shuddered in his control when pushed too far. In that memory lay the entire story of the war. Perfection undone by its own limits, mastery achieved by learning from what once seemed invincible. When asked about those days, Sanders spoke simply. He said the Zero had taught him more about its makers than about its mechanics. They understood beauty, he said, and they trusted it too much. He never spoke with bitterness, never with triumph. He understood something most warriors never live long enough to see, that to truly know your enemy is to feel a strange kinship with him. To master another's design is to share, if only for a moment, the mind that created it. Sanders' data, copied and distributed across factories and training manuals, became part of a new generation's education. Young engineers studied his flight logs at Grumman, Vought, and Douglas. His diagrams, once drawn in pencil and sweat, became reference points for the post-war era of aviation, for jets that would carry the same logic of balance and power into a new age. The Zero had been dissected, but never forgotten. History often remembers heroes by their victories. Sanders' triumph was different, quieter, more intricate. His war was fought not in explosions, but in equations. He proved that understanding an enemy does not mean glorifying him, it means refusing to underestimate him. The Zero had demanded respect to be defeated, and in giving it, Sanders found something purer than conquest, comprehension. In that sense, the Akatan wreck had achieved what no propaganda could. It had forced two worlds, two philosophies of flight to meet. Through it, the engineers of one nation came to understand the artistry of another. Knowledge had crossed the boundaries that politics built. The irony of war is that understanding, born in conflict, outlasts the hatred that created it. And as Sanders left the museum that day, the glass behind him caught a reflection of two aircraft, one Japanese, one American, their wings parallel, their stories now inseparable. Because in the end, the true bridge between enemies is not power, it is respect. In the cold silence of Alaska's Aleutian chain, time moves differently. The winds that sweep across Akatan Island carry no trace of battle, only the low hum of the earth reclaiming what war once left behind. Yet buried in its tundra lies a ghost, a moment frozen in steel and silence, the wreckage of a Japanese fighter that changed the Pacific forever. It was here on June 4, 1942, that Petty Officer Tadayoshi Koga met his end. He was 22, a pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most feared aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M0. His squadron had attacked Dutch Harbor 2 days earlier. When anti-aircraft fire severed his fuel line, Koga turned east, hoping to nurse his wounded plane to safety. But the Aleutians are merciless to the unprepared. Fog clung to the ground like smoke, masking the contours of the island below. Believing he was landing on a smooth meadow, Koga lowered his wheels. The moment they touched the bog, the Zero flipped forward and broke its spine. The young pilot died instantly. His aircraft, astonishingly, did not. When American search parties found it weeks later, it looked almost untouched. Propeller bent, canopy cracked, wings still gleaming white in the northern sun. The crew who first saw it could hardly speak. For months, Allied airmen had fought this ghost in the Pacific skies and lost. The Zero had defied every attempt at analysis. Now, by accident, the secret had come to them, a gift of fate and tragedy intertwined. Koga's body was buried nearby, wrapped in canvas and silence. His name was known only from the characters painted on his aircraft's tail. The Americans did not mock him, nor desecrate the site. In the strange fraternity of aviators, even enemies share quiet respect for those who fall from the sky. His plane, however, was lifted from the tundra with reverence bordering on awe. To the men who salvaged it, this was no mere wreck. It was a revelation. From that frozen shore, the Zero was ferried south, from Akatan to Seattle, then to San Diego, where it would be reborn under foreign hands. Mechanics catalogued every bolt, every rivet, every measurement. They noted its elegance, its contradictions, its structure delicate yet precise, its design minimalist yet brilliant. In those details, the Americans began to see not just an enemy, but a philosophy, one that valued mastery of the air over survival in it. What Koga had flown was not a machine of barbarity, but of belief. The Zero was crafted by minds that prized grace above armor, intuition above endurance. It reflected the Japanese ideal that victory belonged to the purest spirit, the most disciplined form. That same purity, as the Americans soon learned, was its weakness, an aircraft so refined it could not afford error. Historians would later call Akatan the hinge of the Pacific War. Before that day, the Zero had seemed untouchable. After it, its invincibility unraveled piece by piece. From its cockpit instruments came new tactics, from its wings, new designs. The Hellcat, the Corsair, the Mustang, all carried fragments of its ghost. In the balance of fate, one man's crash became another nation's awakening. Japan never knew the full magnitude of Koga's loss. His squadron reported him missing, presumed drowned at sea. The secrecy that surrounded the Akatan recovery meant his story would remain hidden for decades. But history does not forget such ironies. The aircraft he died to preserve became the key to his enemy's survival. Today, Akatan is uninhabited. The tundra blooms in summer, and snow buries the wreck's resting place in winter. There are no monuments, no markers, only wind, grass, and silence. Yet to those who know the story, the island itself feels sacred, a quiet memorial not to victory or defeat, but to the strange symmetry of war. Because from that single accident, a soft landing turned fatal, came the blueprint of dominance. And in the stillness of that northern island, beneath layers of moss and history, the ghost of Tadayoshi Koga still lies waiting, the pilot who never knew he had changed the world. The Hellcat story did not end with victory, it evolved into understanding. By the time Japan's surrender silenced the Pacific, the blue-winged fighter had done more than win a war. It had proven a truth far older than the conflict itself. Mastery is not born from superiority, but from humility. Every rivet on its fuselage, every curve of its wing, carried the lessons of an enemy once feared and misunderstood. The Zero had been the first teacher. Its design spoke a language that Western engineers had dismissed, a poetry of lightness, of balance, of motion unburdened by armor or excess. Before Akatan, America had seen Japan's aircraft as crude imitations. After Akatan, they saw genius. The Zero's engineers had not built a weapon to overpower, they had built one to outthink. And it was only when the United States began to listen, to study, to learn, to respect, that victory became possible. The Hellcat was the product of that humility. It was not designed in defiance of the Zero, but in dialogue with it. Every weakness of the Japanese fighter became a note in Grumman's blueprint. Fragile fuel lines became self-sealing tanks. Vulnerable pilots were surrounded with armor. Thin wings gave way to thicker, stronger ones capable of surviving dives the Zero could never attempt. The Hellcat's power came not from rejecting the enemy's wisdom, but from absorbing it. In that process, the war itself changed shape. It ceased to be a clash of nations and became a conversation between philosophies. The Zero's creators sought transcendence through simplicity, a perfect union between man and machine. The Hellcat's engineers sought endurance through pragmatism, a machine that could protect its pilot even in failure. One prized elegance, the other resilience. Between them lay the spectrum of human invention. For Eddie Sanders, this was more than engineering, it was ethics. Each time he climbed into a test cockpit, he carried with him the unspoken principle that knowledge demanded responsibility. The data he gathered was not just for victory, but for survival, for preventing ignorance from claiming more lives. His calm precision, his refusal to speak in absolutes, became the quiet moral center of an age that was beginning to industrialize destruction. He showed that intelligence could be humane, that understanding an enemy was not betrayal, but a higher form of respect. The lessons spread beyond aircraft. In laboratories and design bureaus across the world, engineers began to study not just what worked, but why. Every nation that took to the sky after 1945, from Britain's Meteor to Japan's post-war Sabres, did so with a new awareness of the delicate balance between speed, strength, and survivability. Flight was no longer instinct, it was philosophy. Even the shape of war changed. The combat doctrines of the next generation, jet dogfights, missile engagements, supersonic interception, all bore traces of the same principle Sanders embodied. Curiosity defeats arrogance. Those who assumed victory had already been achieved were doomed to fall behind. Those who continued to learn, even from defeat, shaped the future. In the years that followed, the Hellcat faded quietly from the runways, its metal weathered, its engines silenced, but its moral outlasted its machinery, the pilots who had once flown it would tell young aviators the same story in different words. Never underestimate what you do not understand. Respect is not weakness, it is foresight. The Zero was never a failure, only a warning against pride. Its spirit lived on, not in Japan's loss, but in the world's progress. The engineers who had built it gave humanity a new vision of flight, one that valued grace as much as power, precision as much as passion. And the Americans who learned from it proved that even in war, imitation could become homage, and understanding could become the truest form of strength. By the time the last Hellcat was retired, the skies themselves had changed. Jet engines replaced propellers, aluminium gave way to alloys, and the horizon grew farther than any pilot could see. Yet the principle remained eternal, that every machine carries within it the mind of its maker, and every victory is built on the courage to learn. The philosophy of flight had begun with rivalry, but ended in reverence. And as the next generation prepared to chase the sound barrier, they did so in the shadow of two aircraft, one Japanese, one American, whose dialogue of motion had taught the world not just how to fly, but how to think. Because in the sky, as in life, arrogance ends where understanding begins. In the grainy black and white footage of the Pacific, the Hellcat glides over a calm sea. Its wings shimmer against the sun, the blue of its paint merging with the horizon. To the camera, it looks serene, effortless, a machine at peace with the sky it once conquered. But beneath that smooth flight, something unseen still lingers, the ghost of the Zero. Every rivet, every curve, every vibration in the fuselage carries the echo of its origin, an enemy's genius transformed into a new kind of strength. The Hellcat was not a rejection of the Zero, it was its reflection, reimagined in steel and discipline. In every climb and dive, it whispered the same paradox. To defeat something perfectly built, you must first understand why it was perfect. From above, the ocean looks eternal, but the war it once held was anything but. In those skies, two philosophies met, one that believed in grace and another that believed in endurance. The Zero danced, the Hellcat endured. And when the dance ended, the endurance remained. The Hellcat did not erase the Zero's legacy. It fulfilled it, the culmination of everything the Akatan wreck had revealed and everything Sanders had learned from it. Every dogfight that followed was less a battle than a dialogue. A conversation between two minds, one Japanese, one American, both reaching toward the same truth from opposite directions. When the Hellcat met the Zero in combat, it was not merely a test of machines, but of understanding. The Hellcat carried the weight of adaptation. The Zero carried the purity of intent. Between them lay the story of human progress, the endless cycle of imitation, innovation, and reflection. Eddie Sanders never lived to see how far that story would go, but his legacy did. In every test flight that pushed a wing to failure, in every engineer who studied an enemy's blueprints with respect rather than arrogance, his quiet philosophy endured. To listen before acting, to understand before judging, to find mastery not in destruction, but in comprehension. The Hellcat's 19-1 kill ratio was not born of hatred, it was born of study. And yet behind the numbers, 5,163 victories to 270 losses, there is a deeper arithmetic, the mathematics of knowledge, the equation that turns tragedy into progress and a single lost aircraft into 1,000 saved lives. The Hellcat was the answer to that equation, not a symbol of vengeance, but of learning made lethal. Today, the last Hellcats rest in museums or sleep in hangars, their wings folded like the pages of a book long finished. But when their engines start, even for a moment, the air trembles with memory. The deep growl of the Pratt & Whitney radial engine is not just noise. It is history breathing again, the sound of one idea evolving through another. For those who listen closely, the machine still speaks. It remembers its maker and the enemy who made it necessary. It remembers the tundra of Akatan, the cold where it all began. It remembers the hand of a test pilot who refused to see enemies as mysteries and the minds that turned defeat into design. The Hellcat's victory was never absolute. It was inherited, passed from one generation of thinkers to the next. And as it soars again in archival footage, sunlight glinting off its wings, it carries a truth larger than war itself. Knowledge once captured never dies. They stole its secrets and built a 19-1 killing machine. But what they really built was something far more enduring, a future shaped not by power, but by understanding.